Welcome back to Asian Art. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Islamic art, and we're going to delve further into the traditions that were inspired and shaped by iconoclastic traditions and iconic traditions and the Islamic idea of barakah. As we last finished our discussion of Islam, we talked about iconoclasm as an idea that has changed and varied over the centuries in the interpretations of whether something was acceptable or not acceptable would alter dramatically depending on the time and the sense of what was correct. It's only indirectly mentioned in the Quran, and there are a number of sort of contradictory ideas that are represented in the Hadith that suggest the idea of iconoclastic traditions. Because there is a reticence to represent things that are alive, there has been a movement toward more abstract forms. As the Kenyan Muslim scholar Ali al-Masrui said, when he grew up as a Muslim, he could draw the mango, but not the mango tree. He could draw a shoe, but not a shoemaker. Making anything that was alive was an attempt to imitate God's unique power. So it's important to remember that in Islam, Muslims want to recognize and acknowledge God's unique power, and therefore hold back from trying to do things as God would do them. In some ways, that means not making art about living things, but it also means not punishing or torturing or acting like God in violent ways. These are ways in which that sense of respect for life and all creation is a part and parcel of this idea in Islam. So moving away from imitating God's unique power, paintings, when they did occur, happened to be very small, and they were very decorative and ornamental, flat, with no shadows, and they would be bound in books, so they would not be sitting there hanging on someone's wall for all to see, but be part of a collection. Books are sacred in Islam because of the Quran being a holy text, and so bound volumes of paintings was a more acceptable format in Islam. Here is a Persian miniature painting of Yusuf and Sarah, an illustration of the Old Testament in the Bible. Now, this painting is relatively small. It would probably easily fit 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And you can see, even in this reproduction, the extraordinary detail of the workmanship that went into this painting. As you zoom in closer to the painting, you'll be amazed at the richness of the tapestries and the designs that fill up this painting. There is not a coherent sense of a geometric space. There is not a sense of volumes making up things. The patterns deliberately flatten out the shapes and forms, suggesting the idea of architecture without imitating an actual space that people could inhabit. And so the emphasis becomes on this sort of geometric ornamentation, book arts. There's a great traditions of music, poetry, and storytelling, all of which do not directly represent things in a literal visual way. If we look even closer at this picture, I think you'll begin to notice something curious. You notice the face of Yusuf has been rubbed out, while the face of Sarah is still there. So the question is, why was this one face rubbed out? Now, the figure of Yusuf has this flaming head, And this is a symbol in early Muslim paintings, indicating that Yosef is a prophet, just like Muhammad and Jesus and many other figures in the Old Testament. And so the flaming head here indicates that this is a holy person. It's possible sometime after this was painted, probably even centuries after it was painted, this painting came into the ownership of someone who was uncomfortable with having a painting where there was a face representing the prophet Yosef, and so discreetly rubbed out the face. Here is an example of the shifting values of iconoclasm. At one point, when this painting was made, it was felt to be acceptable to put a face on Yosef as long as the picture resided in a book, was relatively flat with no shadows, and did not attempt to imitate life directly. Later on, the values shifted, and the idea that the prophet Yosef had a face was uncomfortable to the people who owned the picture, and so his face was rubbed out. These are just an indication of some of the kind of shifting ways in which values about what is appropriate or not appropriate have changed over the centuries. Much of the art that we see in Islam, especially those works that adorn mosques and holy sites, are completely abstract, with very little or no representation of any living thing. Rich ornamental designs, calligraphy. Here is a mosaic into the roof of the mosque Sheikh Luftala from 1616. We see this extraordinary, complex, radiating design, and it radiates out. Along the lower bands, you can see the calligraphy, Arabic portions of the Quran. Now, the use of ornamental designs and forms has a long history in Islam, and especially with the use of complex tile work. We can see these interlocking and expanding forms on many different kinds of places inside a mosque. These intricate designs represent the interconnectedness of all living things, and their extraordinary complex geometry is a way of communicating God's power and beauty and complexity without actually representing any real thing. The extraordinary thing about these designs is that mathematicians have now, analyzed these patterns and realized that mathematically they can be extended outward in every direction, and they never repeat themselves going outward. So that from the center, there's a kind of symmetry that builds out from this one point. And as it extends outward, it never completely comes back the same way. Sort of like God's creation moves out and fills the universe from every direction. There's also an extraordinary tradition of scientific achievement in Islam. And without Muslim scholars, we would not know as much as we do about the classical world and classical science and literature. They were very instrumental in translating into Arabic many important works from ancient Rome and ancient Greece, including this scientific instrument, which is a navigational device called the astrolabe. This is an Arabic interpretation of a Greek and Roman tool that was used to help navigate and discover one's place on a curved surface of the earth. Here is a lovely plate you can see in the Louvre in Paris. It says around its border, "Science, its taste is bitter at the beginning. At the end, it is sweeter than honey. Blessing." And so this plate represents this idea that science is something that is a kind of provocation, a challenge, that rewards people in their deliberate investigation of the truth. A very important idea in Islamic art is the idea of nur, which means light. And as light radiates out, it is a feature you see in a great deal of Islamic works, as a kind of radiating forms. As we talked about earlier, we saw those tile designs that sort of radiated out from a center. Nur also has the sense of illumination and inspiration. And as was seen earlier, this idea of a kind of blessing that comes from light, the idea of nur. This is actually a lamp that would have hung inside a mosque, an oil lamp that would have shone down and illuminated it. And on its surface is a very elaborate calligraphy representing a quote from the Quran that speaks of God is the light of the heavens and the earth. So this physical lamp is designed to give light, and it is there also as a reminder of God's light and God's ability to light the heavens and the earth. And so we see on objects, calligraphy is used as a way to kind of reach and demonstrate God's divine gift, his voice that he spoke to Muhammad, and how Muhammad shared those teachings with his followers. So calligraphy becomes a very important idea here, as well as this idea of radiating forms, but the idea of that calligraphy can sort of represent God's words to Muhammad. Very early on, Arabic writing that was used to record the Quran was fairly plain. Here is an early 8th century Quran, and you can see how the text is sort of laid out in a rather straightforward manner. Within a number of centuries, though, specialists were involved in creating extremely elaborate and ornate Qurans. No expense was spared to create these gold letters and intricate interlocking designs that create a sense of wonder and beauty. A beautifully written Quran is believed also to be this thing called a barakah, a blessing. A blessing in Islam is something which radiates out like nur and gives to those who come in contact with it, and then its blessing from that person can continue to go out and affect other people as well. As you'll notice, the lettering here is quite complicated and almost difficult to read because of the way it's sort of interlocking in its forms. Arabic is read not left to right, but right to left. Early lettering is done in a design called Kufic lettering. There are about 5 main different designs in Arabic lettering. Thuluth lettering is one of the more ornate styles of Arabic lettering. Here is a beautiful example of Arabic calligraphy that is called a Hilye Serif. This one is dated from 1870, and it is using the ornamental niche lettering. This is a passage from the Hadith that is, in a sense, a description of Muhammad. If we translate these words, it reads, "He was not tall and stretched out, nor short and compressed. He was medium-sized. His hair was not short and curly, nor was it lank, but in between. His face was not pudgy, but there was a roundness to it. His skin was white, his eyes were black. He had long eyelashes. He was big-boned and had wide shoulders." And it continues to say, "He had no body hair except in the middle of his chest, and he had thick hands and feet. When he walked inclined as if descending a slope. When he looked at someone, he looked at him full in the face." And so This description of Muhammad is like a painting of him. It is a description that tells us something about who he was, the kind of person he was, and it is the closest you will see in many Arabic countries as to a depiction of who this person really was. It's important to remember this, that today it is considered disrespectful to represent Muhammad, that he, like the early traditions in Buddha, this is an aniconic tradition where we are representing through the signs and symbols of the language of the Hadith. Let's have our review quiz. Question 1. What qualities define Islamic art? Question 2. How did iconoclasm influence Islamic art? Question 3. What is the difference? What is the significance of the geometric designs in Islamic art? Question 4. Why is calligraphy important in Islamic culture? Question 5. How does the Hilye represent Muhammad?